The waiting room at St. Marguerite General smelled like floor cleaner and old coffee, and the fluorescent light above the third row of chairs had been flickering for as long as anyone could remember. Nobody had fixed it. Nobody seemed to notice anymore, except for the people who had been sitting under it long enough to start counting the intervals between flickers. Raymond Collier had been counting for 47 minutes. He was not waiting for a doctor. He was not sick, or not in the way the hospital understood sickness. He was waiting because his truck was in the parking garage getting a block heater cable replaced by his nephew, and the temperature outside had dropped to -22, and the hospital lobby was the only building on that end of Churchill Avenue that would let a person sit without buying something. He had a paper cup of coffee from the machine near the admitting desk, 75 cents, no cream, tasted like it had been brewed sometime before the last federal election, and he held it in both hands because his knuckles still ached when the cold came in fast like this. He was 61 years old. He wore a canvas work coat, dark green, the kind with the quilted lining that compressed flat after enough seasons. His boots were Blundstones, resoled twice. The knuckles on his right hand had a faded scar across the middle joints, the kind that came from working in tight spaces for a long time. He had the look of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors, or in places that felt outdoor adjacent. The kind of weathering that came not from vanity but from years. He was not paying attention to anything in particular when the woman in the wheelchair came through the sliding doors. She came in fast the way people do when they're moving against weather and want to be done with it. A hospital volunteer rushed forward to hold the second set of doors, and she nodded without slowing. Her name was Bridget Annesley. Raymond didn't know that yet. What he knew was that she was somewhere in her mid-50s, dressed well without trying to signal it. Dark wool coat, the kind that cost a real amount of money but didn't advertise a logo, and that she was alone, and that she had the posture of someone who had long ago decided the wheelchair was not going to be the most interesting thing about her. She parked herself near the window, 2 rows over from Raymond, and pulled out a phone, checked it, put it face down on her knee, waited. Raymond went back to watching the flickering light. 17 minutes passed. The man who came through the sliding doors at 6:43 p.m. was wearing a coat that probably cost more than Raymond's truck, which was a 2009 F-150 with a replaced transmission and a back window that fogged on one side. The coat was charcoal, long, European cut. The man under it was in his early 60s, hair silver at the temples in a way that people sometimes called distinguished, tan that did not come from a Canadian winter, shoes that were completely wrong for the weather. His name was Stuart Aldgate, though his name would not matter for long. He looked around the lobby with a particular expression of someone who finds a place beneath comment. His eyes landed on Bridget. He crossed to her without particular haste. "You're here," he said. Not a greeting. An inventory. "I'm here," Bridget said. "I assumed you'd cancel. I said I wouldn't." Aldgate looked around the lobby again. The flickering light, the row of plastic chairs, the coffee machine, the volunteer at the desk reading a magazine, and his expression shifted into something that wasn't quite contempt but was adjacent to it. "I thought you meant the Radisson," he said. "On Mackenzie." I said St. Marguerite. "I have a board meeting at 7:30. I wanted somewhere nearby, a hospital waiting room." He said it the way someone might say the word surreal, except with less generosity. "There are chairs," Bridget said. Aldgate sat in one. He did not look comfortable. He looked like a man performing the act of sitting in a plastic chair while internally drafting a story about it to tell later. Raymond was not listening. He was watching the light. But the lobby was not large, and the next row of chairs was not far, and some conversations arrive whether you invite them or not. "I have to be honest with you," Aldgate said. The kind of sentence that, in Raymond's experience, was never actually an act of honesty. "Please," Bridget said. "I looked into your situation more carefully. After our call last week, my situation, the trust structure." The Aldgate paused, the medical background. He said this last part quietly, though not quietly enough. I didn't realize how significant it was. The long-term prognosis. Bridget didn't answer right away. Raymond found himself looking at the light less. "The prognosis," she said, "is that I run a company with 400 employees, and I take meetings in hospital waiting rooms because I'm efficient with my time. That's the prognosis. I'm not trying to be cruel," Aldgate said. I know, that makes it slightly worse. Aldgate straightened his coat. I think we both know this isn't going to work. The dynamic is. He searched for the word. Raymond could see him searching, which was its own kind of commentary. Complicated. You mean inconvenient? I mean impractical. Bridget looked at him for a moment. Then she looked out the window at Churchill Avenue, where the wind was pulling snow off the roof of the parkade in long, flat sheets. You drove 40 minutes in that, she said, to tell me that in person. I thought you deserved that. I deserved a phone call. This is something you needed. She turned back to him. You needed to look me in the eye so you could tell yourself you did it the right way. Aldgate stood up. He buttoned his coat, starting from the bottom, the way people do when they want to look deliberate. I think it's better this way, he said. I think you should go before the roads get worse, Bridget said. He left. The sliding doors opened and then closed, and the cold that came in for those 3 seconds was enough to feel 2 rows over, which was where Raymond was sitting with his 75-cent coffee, not looking at the flickering light anymore. Bridget sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the window. Raymond was quiet for a while. He had a general policy about other people's moments, which was to leave them alone inside them. He was good at the kind of quiet that did not demand anything from the person next to it. 40 years of working in small spaces with other people had taught him that. But then the woman said, without turning her head, "How much of that did you hear?" "Enough," Raymond said. Right. She was still looking at the window. "Well, I wasn't trying to, I know. It's a small lobby." She turned then and looked at him with the directness of someone who had spent a long time deciding which things were worth her energy and which weren't. "Do you have an opinion about what you just heard?" Raymond considered. "I think the coat was wrong for the weather," he said. "He's going to have a bad drive back." Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, but the territory that borders one. "That's your opinion. You asked what I had." She looked at him properly then, the canvas coat, the Resoled boots, the hands around the paper cup. People looked at Raymond Collier and saw a maintenance worker or a retired tradesperson or someone's uncle who fixed things on weekends. They were not wrong exactly. They were also not complete. "I'm Bridget Ansley," she said. "Raymond Collier." She nodded. "Are you waiting for someone?" "My truck. Block heater cable." She looked back at the window. "Mine is fine. I just don't have anywhere better to be for the next 40 minutes. They sat in something that was not quite silence, because the lobby had its sounds. The desk volunteer turning pages, the elevator chiming, the ventilation doing what ventilation does in old hospitals. But it was the kind of quiet that 2 people can be in without it becoming a problem. After a while, Raymond said, 400 employees. "Sorry? You said 400 employees." Bridget looked at him. "You were listening. Enough," he said again. She studied him for a moment with the practiced attention of someone who had spent decades reading rooms and people in them. "Annesley Holdings," she said. "We do land development. Infrastructure mostly. Some residential." She paused. "You know it? I know the name? From?" Raymond turned the paper cup in his hands. "I did the mechanical survey on the Pemberton site. About 11 years ago. The water table assessment." Bridget went still, not in a dramatic way. In the way of someone recalibrating. "You're an engineer." "Was. Semi-retired now. I do consult work when something's interesting enough. The Pemberton site." She said it slowly. "That survey saved us from a very expensive mistake. The original contractor had missed a drainage variance. We almost broke ground." "I know," Raymond said. "I wrote the report." She stared at him. "Your name was on that report, Raymond Collier P. Eng." He lifted the paper cup slightly, the way someone might lift a glass. "Coffee's terrible here, by the way. I don't recommend it." Bridget Annesley laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes before you decide whether to let it out, so it arrives with its edges unpolished. Raymond thought it was probably her actual laugh, not the one she used in boardrooms. "I've been looking for that engineer for 3 years, she said. "We have another site. Similar geology. I've had 2 firms tell me it's fine, and I don't believe either of them." "Where's the site?" "Harwick Township, about 90 kilometers northeast. Old agricultural land, partial wetland designation, and apparently nobody can agree on where the water table actually sits in spring." Raymond set the cup down on the seat beside him. "It'll sit higher than they're telling you. The melt from Harwick Ridge feeds into the subsoil about 3 weeks before it shows up in the surface drainage." The ag maps don't account for it because the last update was 1987. Bridget looked at him for a long moment. How do you know that? I went to school with a man who farmed that land for 30 years. He told me about his basement. I remembered it. He shrugged. It was a small shrug, the kind that did not ask for recognition. Could be wrong. I'd have to look at the bore logs. I have bore logs, Bridget said. I have 3 sets of bore logs and a hydrology report that I don't trust, and a contractor who starts in 6 weeks. 6 weeks is tight. I know it's tight. That's why I've been trying to find someone who actually knows what they're looking at. Raymond was quiet for a moment. The elevator chimed. The volunteer turned another page. The contractor, Raymond said. Who is it? Pemberton Lacey Group. Raymond made a sound that wasn't quite a word. You know them, Bridget said. It wasn't a question. I know their work. He picked up the coffee cup and then put it down again without drinking from it. Their site supervisor on residential projects is thorough. On commercial, they move faster than the ground can tell them to slow down. This is commercial. I know, she leaned forward slightly. Will you look at the bore logs? You have them with you? I have everything with me. She reached into the bag on the back of her wheelchair and produced a tablet, opened a file, turned it toward him. Raymond put on his glasses, plain wireframes, the kind sold in rotating stands at pharmacies, and looked at the first page, then the second. He turned the tablet himself with her permission and went through 3 more pages without speaking. The third firm's readings are the ones I'd keep, he said finally. But they stopped the bore at 12 meters. You need 16, minimum, to see what's happening at the clay layer. Can we go back and extend the bore? Easier and cheaper to do it now than after you've poured a foundation on top of it. He handed the tablet back. I can give you a list of questions to take to the third firm, or I can go out there myself and take a look if you want an independent read. I want an independent read, Bridget said. What do you charge? Raymond named a number. It was a fair number, not low, not performatively high, just accurate to what the work was worth. Bridget didn't flinch. Can you go this week? Weather permitting. The roads up to Harwick are logged roads past the Curry Creek Junction. I'll need 2 days of clear forecast. I'll call the municipality and get you site access. Can I get a number for you? Raymond took a card from his inside pocket. It was a plain card, white, just his name and a phone number in the PN designation. He had printed 500 of them at a FedEx office on Dunmore Road 4 years ago, and still had most of them. Bridget took the card and looked at it. Then she looked at him again. You've been sitting here for how long? She said. About an hour waiting for a block heater cable. It takes as long as it takes, Raymond said. She put the card in her coat pocket. My nephew does mechanical work, she said. He charges a fair rate. So does mine, Raymond said. She smiled. This time it was the boardroom version, but with something behind it that was warmer than that. I'm sorry you had to witness that earlier. I wasn't witness to anything. I was counting light flickers. She glanced up at the flickering tube above the 3rd row. That's been broken for 2 years, she said. I know because I was here with my mother. Same chair, roughly. I kept looking at it so I didn't have to look at her face when the doctor was talking. Raymond nodded. He didn't say anything. He'd learned a long time ago that some things did not need a response, only a person who would sit in the same space with them and not make it smaller. She's fine now, Bridget said. Retired to Kelowna. Plays pickleball. Good. She would have had a lot to say about Stuart. He had the wrong shoes for the weather, Raymond said. Bridget laughed again, the real one, the one with edges. He did. He genuinely did. Raymond's phone buzzed in his pocket. He looked at it. Truck's ready, he said. He stood, put on his hat, a plain wool toque, dark gray, pulled down over his ears, and picked up the empty coffee cup. He crossed to the garbage can near the admitting desk and dropped it in. Safe drive, Bridget said. You too, he said. Tell the site supervisor at Pemberton Lacey to slow down on the northwest quadrant, even if the bore logs look clean, especially if they look clean. She wrote something on her phone. Is that standard advice? It's specific advice, he said. The northwest corner of that property is where the ridge drainage will show up. If the logs look clean there, it means they didn't go deep enough. She looked up from her phone. How do you know where the ridge drainage will come from if you haven't been to the site? Raymond thought about it for a moment. I looked at the topographic maps in 2019, he said. Someone asked me about an unrelated parcel nearby. I remember the terrain. She stared at him. "Good night," he said, and walked out into the -22. The bore extension came back 3 weeks later. Raymond had driven up to Harwick Township on a Tuesday, when the forecast finally held clear for 48 hours, and spent 2 days on site with a probe and a copy of the original logs and the geological survey from the provincial archives, which was not 1987 but 1991, though the 1987 agricultural map he had mentioned to Bridget turned out to exist in the records of the Harwick Municipal Office, filed under a category called Drainage Easements and Disputes, which told its own story about the land. He filed his report on a Thursday, 14 pages, 3 appendices, 2 recommendations. The second recommendation was to delay the start of the foundation pour by 5 weeks, to allow for a proper assessment of the clay transition zone at 15 meters depth. The first recommendation was to fire Pemberton Lacey Group's site supervisor on the Harwick project, and replace him with the one they used on residential contracts, who Raymond had worked with once before on a project in Beaumont, and found to be thorough in the specific way that mattered. Bridget called him the same afternoon she received it. "You recommended we replace a supervisor by name," she said. "I named the position, not the person. You described him closely enough." "I described the quality of his work on commercial sites," Raymond said. "Annesley Holdings can draw whatever conclusions it wants to from that." There was a pause on the line that he could not quite read. "My legal team is going to ask if this recommendation could expose us to a wrongful dismissal claim." "Tell your legal team that continuing with the current supervision would expose you to a foundation failure on a commercial structure in unstable subsoil," Raymond said. "Then ask them which risk they'd prefer to manage." Another pause, shorter this time. "Point taken, the 5-week delay. I know, I've already called the contractor." She stopped, then, "You were right about the northwest quadrant. The third firm went back down to 16 meters. There's a perched water table sitting right at the clay boundary. It wasn't visible at 12. "No," Raymond said, "it wouldn't be. If we'd poured foundation over that, we'd have had water infiltration within 2 seasons. Possibly structural movement within 5. Yes, we would have been in litigation for a decade. At minimum." The line was quiet for a moment. Outside Raymond's workshop window, he worked out of a converted detached garage on his property in Innisfree, 3 kilometers off the highway, surrounded by spruce and the kind of flat silence that Alberta provides to people who want it. The neighbor's dog was barking at something in the tree line. "I'd like to put you on retainer," Bridget said. "I don't do retainers," Raymond said. "Why not?" He thought about it. "Because when someone pays you monthly, they start thinking they own your time. And then they start thinking they own your opinion." "I wouldn't do that." "You might not mean to," he said, "but the structure tends to produce a certain kind of expectation. Project by project works better for everyone." "All right," she said, not reluctantly, with the efficiency of someone who had heard an argument and assessed it fairly. "Project by project. I'll send you the Coldstream file. We have a similar soil question out there. Send it, Raymond." "Yes. Thank you. Genuinely." A pause. "I don't say that often enough to the people who actually prevent disasters. I mostly hear from the ones who cause them." "You're welcome," he said, and meant it, which was not something he always did. The Coldstream project took the better part of the spring. Raymond drove out twice, filed 2 interim reports, and had 4 phone calls with Bridget's chief engineer, a careful man named Felix, who asked good questions and wrote down the answers and did not pretend to know things he didn't. Raymond respected this. He had worked with a lot of engineers who felt the need to already know everything, and they were almost always more expensive in the long run. In March, Bridget called him about something that was not a project. "There's a hearing," she said. "Municipal level. Consolidated Planning and Variance Committee. Which municipality?" "Beaumont. We have a proposed mixed-use development on the south end of 50th Avenue. The variance application has been sitting for 7 months. The committee chair has been." She paused. "Difficult? About the setback requirements, and the green space allocation, and the parking ratio." She said each item with the tone of someone reading from a list of grievances they had been carrying for some time. "My planning consultant says the application meets every standard. The committee chair keeps finding new interpretations of the guidelines that somehow always land against us. You think it's personal. I think there are 2 other developers in Beaumont, who have been waiting for this parcel to fail. And I think the committee chair is not impervious to certain kinds of informal encouragement. That's a serious claim. It's a careful observation, she said. I'm not claiming anything I can't demonstrate, which is partly why I'm calling you. Raymond waited. The original geotechnical work on that parcel, the site evaluation before we put in the application, was done by a firm called Meridian Technical. The committee has been citing, in the public record, concerns about the drainage infrastructure of the proposed building, citing a report, Meridian's report? Supposedly. Except the report being quoted in the committee minutes contains findings that are not in the version of the report I was given. There are specific paragraphs about subsoil drainage capacity that don't appear in my copy. Raymond was quiet for a moment. He was standing at his workbench, and there was a set of bore logs from the cold stream site laid out under a drafting lamp. He moved them aside without thinking. You're suggesting the report was altered. I'm suggesting the committee has been quoting a version of a technical document that does not match the original. I'd like someone who can actually read a geotechnical report to look at both versions and tell me whether the differences are material. Send them to me. They arrived that afternoon, scanned PDFs, clearly from 2 different sources. Raymond spread them out on his drafting table, both versions, paragraph by paragraph. It took him 3 hours. He made notes in pencil in a small notebook he kept on the left side of the table. The differences were not subtle. They were not accidental. The inserted paragraphs, 3 of them, in a section on page 11 that discussed drainage coefficient calculations, contained numbers that were internally inconsistent with the rest of the document. Not wildly so, subtly so. The kind of inconsistency that would not be visible to a planning committee member reading a summary, or a journalist reading a press release, or a counselor who had been told by someone they trusted that the report raised concerns. It would only be visible to someone who understood what the numbers meant and had read enough geotechnical reports to recognize when a coefficient had been arrived at by calculation versus when it had been arrived at by a word processor. Raymond called Bridget. The inserted section uses a drainage coefficient of 0.61 for what they're classifying as medium-density mixed use, he said. The rest of the report uses a coefficient that's consistent with current Alberta Land Stewardship Act guidelines, which puts that category at 0.45 to 0.52 in plain language. The number they inserted is 40% higher than the standard range. It makes the drainage capacity look inadequate when it isn't. If you use the actual coefficient from the methodology section 3 pages earlier, which is internally consistent with the rest of the document, the drainage infrastructure the development proposes is within guidelines. So the inserted section contradicts the methodology already in the report. It does. Not dramatically, but yes. Anyone who read both sections carefully and checked them against the provincial standards would see it. The committee members read a summary. I expect so. Bridget was quiet. Raymond could hear something in the background, an office, other voices, the faint percussion of a building that held a lot of people in their work. Can you write this up? She said, formally. With the references. Yes, quickly? Define quickly. The next committee hearing is in 6 days. Raymond looked at his drafting table, at the bore logs from Coldstream, at the 2 reports side by side with his pencil notes in the margins. 5 days, he said. Thank you. Bridget, yes. When you bring this to the hearing, bring the full methodology section of the original report. Printed, not a scan. Printed, so the formatting is clean, and put the provincial standard reference on the same page as my analysis. Don't make them look back and forth. People stop following when they have to look back and forth. A pause. Are you planning presentations now as well? I'm telling you what I know about how people read documents under pressure, Raymond said. You can do what you want with it. She did what he suggested. The hearing was the Tuesday after a long weekend. The committee room at Beaumont City Hall was the kind of room that had been designed to accommodate 12 people and frequently hosted 30. Raymond was not there. He had no reason to be there. He had filed his technical analysis as a supporting document to Annesley Holdings' formal response to the committee, and his job was done. He heard about the hearing from Bridget 2 days later. She called at 9 in the morning, which was earlier than she usually called. Raymond was in the workshop, replacing a bearing in a piece of equipment that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with the fact that the equipment belonged to his neighbor, and Raymond had a general inability to know something was broken and not fix it. The committee chair withdrew his objections before the vote, she said. All of them? All of them. He cited procedural concerns about the supporting documentation that had been entered into the public record on behalf of the objection. She paused. He did not use the word fabricated. He didn't need to. No, the variance passed. 6-1. Good, Raymond. A pause longer than the others. I want you to know what you prevented. That development has 48 affordable housing units in it. There are families on a wait list. The project has been delayed 7 months already. If it had been delayed another year. It wasn't, Raymond said. No, but that's because someone read the fine print. Raymond set down the bearing wrench. Outside, the spruce were moving in a light wind, and the sky was the pale high blue that Alberta sometimes produces in late spring, the kind that looks like it was washed clean by the previous week's cold. You would have found it eventually, he said. Maybe. But eventually isn't this Tuesday. She cleared her throat. I'd like to have dinner, as a thank you. Not a business dinner. An actual dinner. Raymond considered this. He was not a man who required a great deal of social calibration, but he was precise about the kind of company he kept, and he had learned that precision mattered. Where? He said. There's a place on White Avenue called Carmichael's. It's quiet enough to have a conversation and good enough to be worth going to. What time? 7. Friday, if that works. It works, he said. There was a moment on the line that had a different quality than their other moments on lines. A pause that was not about information or next steps, but was just a pause. The kind two people share when they have arrived somewhere neither of them had planned to be, and neither of them is quite ready to say so out loud. I'll see you Friday, Bridget said. I'll be there, Raymond said, and then because it was accurate, and because he had spent 61 years learning that accuracy was usually better than silence, I'll probably be early. She laughed, the real one. So will I, she said.